Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Bob Unger Show, and we have a very special guest today to talk about something that unfortunately very few people are aware of, and it may seem outlandish and shocking, but I don't know at this point in our history what could possibly shock anybody. It's kind of like when people ask me, do I believe in aliens? Why not? Today, anything could be possible, considering what's going on in this country. And our guest is Joe Allen, who has written a book called AEON, or some people say AEON. And the book is about transhumanism. And I'm just going to ask Joe to give us a little bit of his background and then get into the book and how he got his level of interest in this subject of transhumanism and what was his metamorphosis into that interest. So, Joe, tell us about yourself and how you got involved.
Bob, very good to be here. Thank you very much. The quick correct, the title is Dark Eon.
Okay, yeah, Dark AEON.
But in some ways, I would say it's an homage to Carl Jung and his fine book Eon, which was a runaway bestseller. I think probably 5 people have read it, or at least 4 out of the 5 claim to have read it. So it's if you send people to that, maybe 6 people will have read Carl Jung, at least Eon the full. So your question, how did I come to the way I would describe it, a skeptical view of technology progress, and how did I come to perceive technology as a negative force? You could say that a lot of it comes from being raised in a small town and raised with a close contact to nature, and seeing, maybe you can say it's sentimental, seeing how quickly, when a small town is being developed out, how quickly the natural beauty is destroyed. It was very young that I started to get, I guess, a sense on a more intellectual level of how technology could be used to wreck human freedom. That was by coming across Theodore Kaczynski's Industrial Society and Its Future. Many would know it as Uncle Ted's Unabomber Manifesto. I, of course, found it on the internet, read it on a big, clunky desktop computer in the late 90s. And it really struck me then. It had a pretty deep impact. Kaczynski's central thesis is just that technological development is being pushed forward by people who do not have a holistic picture of what they are doing in mind. They're simply following their own internal motives, their power principle, and that, as I would summarize it, human beings are just smart enough to create a mechanical cage around the planet, but not smart enough to find their way out. And so, of course, Ted went nuts, and that's the end of his story. After killing some 3 people and injuring 23 others, he died this year, as your listeners may be aware, reportedly by suicide in prison. I would say also, as far as just the imagination of what the future could be with runaway technology, Ray Kurzweil's The Age of Spiritual Machines had a very profound impact on me. And when I read it, I did not read it the way he intended, as many people, I think, felt. It was an image of a totalizing technological system that would pervade not only every aspect of the human being, every aspect of the natural world, and then out into the cosmos. That the singularity, as he described it, would mean this radical expansion of human intelligence by way of digital intelligence out into the cosmos. So in many ways, and he also references Kaczynski quite a bit in the book, but in many ways, I would say that those two are polar opposites, that they represent, as I described it in the book, an angel and a demon dancing on the head of a single pin. They see the same image, but they see it in 2 completely different ways. So after 9/11 as well, the expansion of the security apparatus of the United States, the the expansion of the NSA's powers, the Patriot Act, the open declaration that digital communications would be monitored, in many ways, the subversion of the First Amendment, the right to free speech, and because people were afraid to say what they thought for fear of being targeted by the security state, and also just the freedom from illegal or unwarranted search and seizure, even of one's intellectual pursuits or one's mind. Those alarmed me quite a bit as a young man after 9/11, much more so than the threat of terrorism, actually, because however dangerous terrorists are, and they are, the threat of an apparatus like that in the wrong hands is far, far greater. Obviously, the United States and its military and its intelligence agencies and its various internal security services in the wrong hands are far more powerful and far more dangerous than ragtag bands of Muslims in the desert. So that also really kind of casts the entire system in a dark light. It just seemed to overshadow everything with a sense of surveillance and also a sense of menace that any thought that would be outside of that system could be criminalized, and so on and so forth. Two other things that I'll tell you really affected my view on technology insofar as its potential for negative consequences. I went to Boston University. That was where I took my graduate degree. And at Boston University, I worked with the Center for Mind and Culture. And the Center for Mind and Culture is a think tank. It was founded, I believe, late 2015, early 2016. It was founded by my advisor at Boston University. Over the course of my education and my time there, I got to know pretty much everyone involved. Many became very good friends, including my advisor. These are very good people, yet the projects they were working on bothered me a great deal. The main projects were using artificial intelligence to model social systems, to model social networks, to model human psychology, especially human psychology as it's related to religion, so that you would have multi-agent models. So, you could think of it, the populations would differ, but think of it as a city of 1 million people. That may be a large estimate, but just think of it that way, a city of 1 million people, each of which are modeled psychologically to be different. And each of them modeled to have certain views as well as biological instincts. And what you would do is run a simulation if you do this, if this social change were to occur, if this external factor were to be applied, is to model potential for religious violence. If the presence of a certain group is there, then how will the group react? And I'm simplifying this a great deal, but we're talking about modeled systems that are intended to test psychological hypotheses and sociological hypotheses about human behavior. And this was used, I mean, we're talking about with a great deal of funding and a great deal of interest, was used with the intention of crafting public policy. So that would mean that to the extent that this happens, public policy would be influenced or perhaps entirely crafted on the basis of computer modeling. Fast forward a few years to the beginning of the pandemic, and many of your listeners will probably remember that Imperial College London produced a model at the very outset of the pandemic, and the model was produced by one Neil Ferguson, and that model predicted, if I recall correctly, 500,000 Brits dead within 6 months and 2 million Americans dead within that time period.
If I'm not mistaken, that was
and it was on the.
I'm sorry. Hello? Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Just want to ask you, if I'm not mistaken, that was the guy who wanted to lock everything down and was sneaking out of his place to have sexual affairs with a married woman. That's the guy, right?
Yeah, well, I guess technically they were polyamorous, so she was married, but they weren't cheating. Yeah, Professor Lockdown, they called him. but yeah, that really was the spark that drove a lot of the fear around COVID was a computer model. So all of this is to say, Bob, that uh, very young, I had a suspicion of the dangers of technology, especially the danger of losing human faculties by turning over those faculties to the machine. And that reliance on technology and its downside were readily apparent with the response to COVID on the basis of a flawed computer model. And as computer modeling becomes more and more prevalent, and it is, along with every other element of the technological system, and transhumanism being the ideology that sits at the top of that system, or at least has a prominent place in that system, uh, say that my early misgivings have been vindicated to my mind.
You were breaking up. Can you hear me?
Are you still with me?
Yeah, you broke up for a
Yes, yes.
second.
Sorry. Can you hear me?
Maybe
Are we
maybe
good?
the NSA is listening. Can you hear me now?
Maybe. I guess they wouldn't be doing their jobs if they weren't, right?
Yeah. Can you define transhumanism in as simple a way as you can for the average
Transhumanism is
guy?
the goal to transhumanism is the goal to optimize the human being by way of technology. And the end result of that is merging human beings with machines.
And when you say to improve or raise the level of human beings, is that a subjective goal in their mind, or is that something that you can objectively say about transhumanism?
I suppose it begins with subjective standards of beauty, intelligence, and strength. But having established that as a subjective value, there are metrics to gauge IQ, to gauge one's bench press, or how fast one can run a mile. There are even ways to quantify beauty, whether it be by quantifying the popularity of a beautiful face, or to simply judge the symmetry and the proportions of a face. So all those things are both subjective and objective. They begin subjectively, this is what I want, and then objectively by applying quantification to it. I think that really is where the danger lies. To me, the quality is far more important than the quantity of anything. And so long as quantification is subject to the value of quality, which is in fact subjective, but I don't care. That's fine. But so long as the quantity is subject to the quantity is just simply a helpful tool. To the extent that quantity becomes, we end up in the reign of quantity, as Rene Guénon would say, then we've crossed over into a realm that's pretty horrific, especially to the extent that quantification is applied through systems of power, and that your value is based as a human being, or the value of any subgroup of human beings is based on quantity, and your freedoms or your privileges or your rights are in some way determined by quantity. A social credit score would be a good example of that, by the way. Now you're entering nightmare territory.
What is the view of a transhumanist, the typical view, as to the attributes of the ideal human being in a transhumanist society?
Oh, that's a tough one because there's so many transhumanists. It's something I try to capture is how varied their views are. I mean, these are human beings, and in fact, many of them are, however despicable their ideas are, as human beings, they're quite interesting. But and that's one reason I hate transhumanism so much. It seeks to destroy what is, or at least replace and augment out of existence what is best about humans. But uh, I would say a typical trajectory for this. It begins with genetics. It begins with the desire to perfect the human genome, to eliminate what they consider to be the mistakes that were left over from natural selection, those genes that were not selected out by nature, and to use technology to correct those directly rather than, and also to use technology to detect them and eliminate embryos. This is a common practice among the wealthy now. It's also becoming more and more affordable, so it's becoming a common practice across the board to scan for things like, if you're screening for Down syndrome, or you're screening for Tay-Sachs, or you're screening for something like even on the more exacting level, certain cancers, and then you produce, say, 10 to 15 embryos. You screen them all, you freeze them. When the tests come back, you eliminate the losers, right? You send them off to the cherub ward, you keep the winner. So there are different ways that happens, and it's not just transhumanists. I mean, transhumanism, I think, has such a stigma. It's already being called other things, and it will be called other things going forward. My biggest fear is that one day transhumanism will just simply be called the science. Another thing that transhumanists focus on a lot is optimizing intelligence. So there's the genetic element of that, but there's also just optimizing brain function. And that can be done different ways. It can be done through neurotropics. You take various drugs. Monofidil is one of the big ones. They're, even Adderall, things like that. Also, just maintaining certain rhythms and routines and quantifying them so that you optimize your intelligence. They consider digital technology in general to be a real step forward in the advance of human intelligence, because of obviously the wide variety of information and the ability to search, the kind of human machine symbiosis that occurs with digital technology and information flow. But then you move outward from there to artificial intelligence, the creation of a supreme, human-like mechanical mind, or human-like digital mind. And that's really, for most transhumanists, not all, but most transhumanists, that creation of a supreme intelligence by way of artificial intelligence, by way of digital technology, that's become a kind of holy grail. And the goal for most is to create such an artificial mind, a godlike artificial intelligence, and to merge with it. And so there are various proposals for that. Already they would say we are merging with the simpler artificial intelligence systems with these interfaces like we're on right now, and I would say they are correct. And the goal is to create a far superior artificial intelligences and to create far superior ways of connecting the human mind to them. The most classic example would be the brain implant like Neuralink, but there are many proposed methods. And once that happened, basically human beings would be perpetual symbiotes with that system. Human beings would be directly connected to these intelligent systems and would become in some way supreme. That's the goal. That's the idea. I myself think that it's possible. That's a nightmare. And if they're incorrect, the mistakes would also be nightmarish. So I think the preservation of cultures that are untouched by this is extremely important.
And what kind of cultures are untouched by this? What kind of cultures are untouched?
The Amish would be a good example. The Orthodox Jews are another good example. There are various Christian communities that do their best to be Luddites. It's a good example. Oddly enough, ironically enough, they're hippie communes, which are, they do their best to minimize technology. Outside of the American context, I couldn't really say so much. I mean, I hear about things. Obviously, a lot of traditional cultures are untouched by many technologies, but one of the really amazing and to me also quite startling and scary things about the age we live in now, even the most remote tribes are getting smartphones. And I don't think any technology has really changed human life so much, so rapidly, and so viscerally. You can feel it, you can see it right in front of your eyes. And so, with the dissemination of smartphones and digital technology, for all the advantages they provide, and obviously they do, nobody would take them if they didn't provide the advantages, right? But as far as social engineering all of humanity from the top down, that dissemination of smartphones is a great leap forward, so to speak. And I think that whatever sort of isolated communities there were have mostly been discovered and changed. And going forward, I think that will be the case. I think going forward, those communities that preserve what was ancient in human culture, what was ancient in human ways of life, and what is so to speak, natural in the human being, those that preserve that will have to do so intentionally and will have to do so at great sacrifice. Whether that will happen or not is yet to be seen. But I think enough people are understanding that this pristine image of the future that futurists and transhumanists and posthumanists put forward ain't going to work out like they say, at least not exactly. And so I would like to think that there will be a lot of people who hold back, but we'll see.
Perhaps you can link up for us the relationship, if any, between who are the major players in the transhumanist movement, number one. Number two, how did the COVID regime fit into all this? And also neo-Malthusianism and population control. And perhaps you can interweave those things for us.
Well, transhumanism is a limited intellectual movement. So it's a very kind of tight clique of intellectuals, and it's a very tight clique of specific intellectuals that go by the name transhumanist. There are other futurists, other people that you could, other intellectuals and technologists you could say are transhumanists because they fit that model. But the transhumanists themselves are people like Max Moore, who in many ways adopted transhumanism and made that the moniker for what I'm talking about. His wife, Natasha Vita-Moore, they're Oxford. Of course, among the most famous is Ray Kurzweil. Ray Kurzweil, the inventor and futurist, whose predictions are lauded as being 86% accurate, although I've never seen, for all the hype about quantity, I've never seen that laid out prediction by prediction. But let's just say that I'm familiar enough with his work that absolutely many of his predictions have come to pass, and to an alarming extent. And so Ray Kurzweil, I think, is very, very important, not only because of the media spotlight put on him, but also because of his position at Google. He's a research and development director at Google. Most of his work was on natural language processing and things like chatbots, which are now becoming very prominent in society, not only as a media phenomenon, but literally integrated into the systems. And that also highlights another thing about the transhumanism. Transhumanism, so you've got this tight core of intellectuals, whether they be the transhumanists or the Russian cosmists or the eugenicists, all of these overlap, but from different intellectual centers. Then you have the much larger systems and much more powerful systems, and those systems being the corporations in Silicon Valley, in Seattle, all over China, in Israel, in India, more and more, in Europe. You have just all over the world, you have these technology firms that are working on the things that transhumanists dreamt up. Very few transhumanists are themselves working directly on these things in a meaningful way, right? I mean, that's not to say all of them. Transhumanists such as Bing Goertzel, very active in Singularity Net, which is an artificial intelligence company seeking to create godlike AI, and they are successful to some extent in the projects they're working on. His partner David Hansen, who is responsible for the robot Sophia, the outward appearance, and the robotics themselves. You've got some who are working in it, but by and large, what we would say is transhumanism that actually affects our lives. That comes out of the big corporations. And those who I know who work in these corporations and those who are adjacent to it, and even from the writings of the people and the public statements of the people in these corporations who run them, the CEOs, such as Larry Page, there is a strong, either openly or an implicit transhumanist bent to the ideas that they're putting forward and the ideas that drive the actual technology. So there you have Google, you have Mark Zuckerberg with his metaverse, right? And just social media in general, this relationship that human beings develop with technology and the creation of a digital persona that comes to, in many people's minds, be more important than one's actual social identity. You have companies like Microsoft, beneath Microsoft's word processing software and things like that. You have a lot of projects that are very, very transhumanist in their orientation. And their partnership with OpenAI is really important, because OpenAI, who created GPT, the artificial intelligence under ChatGPT, OpenAI is partnered with Microsoft. GPT technology is being integrated into Microsoft's products, and people like Bill Gates, who were always Bill Gates is a good friend of Ray Kurzweil, but Bill Gates has never really endorsed these ideas of artificial general intelligence or singularity publicly. He is now, on the basis of the advances in GPT technology. So here you have the intellectual core, you have the corporations where it's more diffused, but obviously much more impactful on the population. And then you have other ideological hubs like the World Economic Forum. And they've really come into the spotlight after the pandemic response, because the policies that were proposed and pushed out, the white papers and policy papers that were pushed out of the World Economic Forum, many, if not most of them, were adopted around the world by governments and by corporations. And so the importance, people really got to see in real time the importance of the World Economic Forum as an ideological hub. And Klaus Schwab, the founder and chairman of the World Economic Forum, has always been very much a techno-optimist, but his book, his 2016 book, really published 2015, but we'll say 16, The Fourth Industrial Revolution, is in many ways a manifesto for transhumanism. It's very bland, it's very corporate, it doesn't really capture the grand visions that underpin what he's talking about. But many prominent transhumanists have been invited to speak at the World Economic Forum. Many transhumanist adjacent futurists are always at the World Economic Forum every year. And so the Fourth Industrial Revolution really was a declaration of the agendas of transhumanism, as people would say, are to be rolled out in the more powerful corporations and governmental bodies around the world. I don't see it as conspiracy, though. It may sound that way. I just think that as the technology advances, people react to it and respond to it in different ways. And that intoxicated enthusiasm is one of the ways. And what's really alarming is that intoxicated enthusiasm is being embraced by and openly proclaimed by an organization like the World Economic Forum, individuals like Klaus Schwab. It's described very articulately by people like Yuval Noah Harari. People have different opinions on different ways of taking what he's saying. But then I think more dangerous ideas, if only because of the blind optimism coming out of the World Economic Forum, come from people like Parag Khanna, author of Hybrid Realities and Move and American Technocracy. And Parag Khanna was groomed by the World Economic Forum from a very young age, and he's a businessman, but I think his vision of what the planet should look like, because by way of technology, is just unvarnished technocracy and transhumanism merged together. Very disturbing to imagine a future as described by him to live in that. So, and then you have others like Kai-Fu Lee, author of AI Superpowers. He's a Chinese businessman, investor. Sinovision is his business. Obviously, you don't do business in China like that without being directly connected to the Chinese Communist Party. And Kai-Fu Lee. Obviously, all these people think of things differently. Kai-Fu Lee doesn't believe a singularity is imminent. Kai-Fu Lee doesn't believe that computers will be sentient anytime soon. Kai-Fu Lee doesn't believe that there will be a viable brain-computer interface. You take away all those elements of transhumanism, and what's left is just simply the same sort of techno-optimistic vision in which human beings, especially small children, are given an AI partner that becomes their educator throughout life, and that the world is basically run by these techno corporations, and our lives are suffused by technology, and the distinction between reality and the digital world dissolves. So that was going a long way, but it was a big question. I think I've identified the three main ways that I see this unfolding of the mechanisms or the vehicles. You have the intellectual core, you have the various corporations who are developing these technologies and producing the corporate propaganda behind them. You have ideological hubs like the World Economic Forum. I think one element I didn't hit, but is also a very important part of it, you have the military. DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, is responsible for the funding and development of a lot of these technologies that I'm talking about right now. And the US military has been a vehicle for a lot of the development for robotics, for even genetic engineering. DARPA was provided the originals or some of the original seed funding, for instance, for the mRNA vaccine. And you also have the same connection, but it's much tighter, much more tightly coupled in China with the military and the tech corporations. So that's a fourth element. And to your question about neo-Malthusianism, again, there's such a wide variety of thinkers. Some of these transhumanists believe that human beings will multiply into the many trillions and we'll all go out into the stars and we'll live off planet and there won't be any need to ever cap human population, right? And then others or maybe they don't, no one is as bold and brash as the Malthusians of the mid 20th century anymore. None that I've read. If anybody is aware of bold and brash declarations that are not phony, please send them my way that are from any time after, say, the 80s. But if you look back at like the Club of Rome, if you look back at the book, was it Paul Ehrlich that wrote The Population Bomb?
Yeah.
You look at Malthusian, Thomas Malthus, his own work, Darwin, Galton, pretty much any intellectual, Haldane, I mean, any intellectual of that era, that was at least on their minds, whether they signed on to it or not. And this idea that humans would just simply explode because there was an explosion in population. They just played it forward as any futurist does. They look at present trends, the historical trajectory, they project it into the future. They saw a planet swarming with poor people and the elites wouldn't be able to get their coffee on time or whatever. And so the solution would be to destroy as many human beings or to curtail the reproduction of as many human beings as possible. That is implicit in a lot of these people. I mean, obviously, Bill Gates is big on population control and reduction. People like Ted Turner have openly proclaimed this. A lot of the people who are associated with the World Economic Forum, a lot of people that are associated with Harvard, a lot of people that are associated with Oxford. I mean, these ideas are still there. They're just more tempered and maybe a little less urgent. But population control, it's a very tricky question. I fear that conservatives have handed that argument over to globalist intellectuals and leftists. I think that the argument needs to be taken very seriously to the extent that human life is preserved. You don't have to be, you don't have to be Albert Einstein. You don't have to be a mathematician on the level of Maxwell or Leibniz to know that if human beings, if every human couple pairs and those human couples produce 8 babies apiece, and it's, let's say you have like a Catholic dream going on the planet, you only got so much time before you really do run out of room. I mean, there's a lot more space than Thomas Malthus thought, but there is a limited amount of space. And if the human race isn't going to die off in the next, say, 200 years, 300 years, then these things really do have to be taken seriously. You have to, if you don't want to go with their estimates, you're going to have to come up with one of your own, because unlimited reproduction of human beings over a long period of time with every single human being on the planet, you have to figure out how many is too many. Is it 20 billion? Is it a trillion? Is it 5 trillion? Whatever. So that topic, I think, is very sticky because nobody wants their own bloodline to be curtailed. And certainly nobody, traditional people don't want to see mass abortion, and many traditional people don't want to see mass birth control. At the same time, okay, well then what happens in 300 years? And if you're going to say that the human race just won't be here, well, I guess you're not too far different than Thomas Malthus.
And how does COVID and the agenda regarding COVID fit into all this? And
The
the
Great Reset.
response?
The Great Reset was an obvious declaration that it would be an acceleration of the adoption and imposition of digital technologies due to COVID measures. That was clear, and I don't know how much of it was independent and how much is coordinated. A lot of it was an eruption out of the World Economic Forum, but you began to see this everywhere. You begin to see all of these different tech corporations, their products became a necessity and not an option. And even this platform we're on right now, Zoom, suddenly exploded because it was no longer an option. It was the mandated method of communicating. And you read The Great Reset, and again, like the Fourth Industrial Revolution, it's quite boring, but the nuggets that are interesting are very interesting. And Schwab and his co-author Thierry Mallory, they really lay out what they see for the future, all the different new normal elements that would be permanently integrated. They foresaw digital communication being permanently integrated. They foresaw the use of robotics being permanently integrated. They foresaw the surveillance that was mandated because of COVID being permanently integrated into society. It's been very heartening to see now we stand in the middle of 2023 to see that it didn't turn out exactly as they thought. It really has been pushed back by popular and populist rejection of these, but not enough for my taste. And in the wake of all that, as the populists have really become awakened to how much our lives are controlled by these people and how these technologies are the mechanisms of control, in waltzes Elon Musk. And Elon Musk is probably the most overtly transhumanist of the tech oligarchs. He is much more brazen about it than any of the others. And yet he has become an icon for the populist right and the right in general. I don't think that this was, if that is a conspiracy and it's all just some kind of a coordinated Hegelian dialectic, I think it's one that's orchestrated by Satan. I don't really think that any one human cabal is behind this. I think it's the natural outgrowth of people's response to technology, but that's what's happened. And in the wake of I have a chapter in my book called A Global Pandemic as Initiation Rite. And I do my best to chart, from my perspective, many others have done this, with my own flavor and perspective, chart the ways in which all of these technologies that are pushed by transhumanists, from AI to robotics to genetic engineering, really became embraced and acceptable in the wake of the COVID hysteria and the response.
And what about this concept that I have read about, that they claim, they being the transhumanists, that you can download the human soul, which they refer to as the essence, which is just a euphemism. What about this? What are they saying with regard to that?
So I think a lot of people hear that and they dismiss it outright. Like, that's ridiculous. How could you even do that? I think the more someone looks into how it's described and the more someone is really introspective about how their lives are unfolding, the more alarming it becomes. So there are three basic methods that this is supposed to happen. One would be to simply replicate the brain structure, the physical brain structure in silico. That is not going to be around the corner anytime soon. I don't care what people believe they have behind closed doors. That one's going to be pretty slow rolled. The other is to slowly integrate the brain with the technologies and kind of replace the brain with silicon circuits. Also, right, that's not right around the corner. Ain't going to happen. That's one of the few predictions I'll stand behind. Ain't going to happen in 5 years. Probably ain't going to happen in 10. Probably ain't going to happen anytime soon. The one that really alarms me, and this is not because I think that they're going to download my soul. It's not like I'm Amish or Sioux, right? But The idea is to simply replicate the patterns of the human mind, what I would say are the outward expressions of the human soul, to replicate those in silico and to keep them in perpetuity. And what that means is that you use self-surveillance, intentional self-surveillance, to record your thoughts, to record your behaviors, to record your desires, to record your physical structure, and then replicate that in silico. And eventually, once enough information is gathered, the idea goes from the same information you're giving to Google every day, the same information you're giving to Amazon every day, same information you're giving to Facebook and Twitter every day. If all of that were gathered in the aggregate, you would be able to use artificial intelligence to replicate that person's psyche. I do not think that I could not replicate you, Bob, by doing this. But what you can do is create a very, oftentimes eerily reminiscent ghost, a kind of wraith of a person. And they can do this easily now. You look at the way in which a large language model works. If you train a large language model on an individual person's literary output and communications, it will start to answer in ways that are eerily similar to the person you trained it on. And if you create a deep fake of someone's face, you take a photograph of every single element, you have them move around and all that, you record it. The artificial intelligence can, in fact, learn the physical features and replicate that. And most alarming, and this will be a big problem going forward in the very near future, to replicate someone's voice, someone's speech patterns, the way their voice sounds, with their lips flapping and their tongue flapping. You can do that very, very quickly. Someone could take 5 minutes of this clip and replicate either of our voices pretty well. If you have that data over a long period of time, you can do that pretty well. So there you have three elements: the verbal expressions, which is our main way of communicating with each other, the physical appearance and physical expressions, the facial expressions, and then the voice. And so you can create a ghost, what Martine Rothblatt or Ray Kurzweil would call a mind clone. And that mind clone would survive even after the physical body goes away. And anyone who's ever been on social media and seen what happens when someone dies and their social media platform remains up, or their profile remains up, and people are talking to it and, like sending messages to the dead, sometimes sending messages even a year or more after they're dead. That already the system is already in place psychologically and socially. And so it's really only a small leap, and big corporations are talking about this. Small startups are dedicated to this, to have a social media profile like that didn't go silent, that just kept talking, and people kept talking to it. And so you have the digital undead. And that would be actually a quite tangible and quite realistic way of uploading the mind into the computer. It's already happening.
Maybe that's what Joe Biden is.
People have suggested as much.
Okay, well, Joe Allen, author of Dark Aeon, or Aeon, depending on how you pronounce it. It's a very interesting topic. Very few people are aware of it. And the way I look at it subjectively, in a simple manner, is that we have a war going on between people, for lack of a better phrase, who are God-centered, who believe that the creation was done by God, versus the people who think they are God. And that's where the war is. You see it in the transhumanistic transgender movement, taking God's creation with a man who has a penis becoming an admiral wearing a dress. Man decided that he should wear a dress because he's a woman. And this is where I see the conflict. When you really break it down in terms of what most people can understand, do you worship the creation or the creator? And do you think that the creator is above you, or you're above the creator? And I think that's what it boils down to. And the arrogance that I see in these people who think that they're smarter than God, I have the feeling, and I don't consider myself to be a holy roller or the most religious guy in the world, but I think that their arrogance will reap the whirlwind, as Chuck Schumer said about Judge Kavanaugh, that they'll reap the whirlwind. I think that they're heading for quite an interesting place after they're dead on Facebook, and they won't need any winter clothing for where they're going. That's my personal view. But thank you so much for being on the program, and for all your knowledge. To meet a guy who knows his subject these days is very rare in a nation that has become, blind, deaf, and dumb, frankly. And I really would hope people would go out and get your book, Doc Eon or Aeon, and learn something. And that's the key to all of our existence, to try to be a little bit more knowledgeable in the next hour than we are today. And I also noticed that underneath your picture, it says War Room Pandemic. Where does that title emanate from? I mean, what does that relate to?
That's I should probably change that. That's Steve Bannon's show. That's was
Oh, okay.
War Room Pandemic. Now just Steve Bannon's War Room. And
Okay.
Steve Bannon is basically the last 2.5 years of really immersing myself in transhumanist philosophy. I failed to mention that in the story. I guess it's because it's I feel like so many people know that, but not everybody. And so that was really the impetus for diving so deep. And he's really the one that made the book possible. Absolutely, Steve Bannon made the book possible.
I actually met him at a dinner for Israel in New York City several years ago. And I've always been very curious about him because he seems to know to a large degree what's going on. But today you can never be sure, since so many people, talk one way and then do something that is exactly the opposite, whether it's Donald Trump or Netanyahu in Israel. And that's why we've got to stick with principles, not principalities, and have a standard that comes from somebody who's superior to us. And I don't mean human beings. I mean call it what you want, call it Yahweh, Jehovah, whatever term you want to use, but a objective arbiter of truth, as opposed to our subjective, emotionalized opinions. And once again, get Joe Allen's book, Dark Aeon, and it was a pleasure talking to you, and hopefully we'll meet again.
Thank you very much, Bob. Very good
Okay.
to talk to you.
You too. Take care.